Section 7 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, Part 1. Derues by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by George Burnham Ives. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 7. It was the only line of defence which remained open to him, and he clung to it with the hope of imposing on the magistrates by redoubled hypocrisy and pious observances. But all this laboriously constructed scaffolding of lies was shaken to its base and fell away piece by piece. Every moment brought fresh and overwhelming revelations. He professed that Madame de Lamotte had died suddenly in his house, and that, fearing suspicion, he had buried her secretly. But the doctors called on to examine the body declared that she had been poisoned with corrosive sublimate and opium. The pretended payment was clearly an odious imposture, the receipt a forgery. Then, like a threatening spectre, arose another question, to which he found no reply, and his own invention turned against him. Why, knowing his mother was no more, had he taken young de Lamotte to Versailles? What had become of the youth? What had befallen him? Once on the track, the cooper with whom he had lodged on the 12th of February was soon discovered, and an Act of Parliament ordered the exhumation of the corpse buried under the name Beaupré, which the cooper identified by a shirt which he had given for the burial. Derues, confounded by the evidence, asserted that the youth died of indigestion and venereal disease, but the doctors again declared the presence of corrosive sublimate and opium. All this evidence of guilt he met with assumed resignation, lamenting incessantly for Edouard, whom he declared he had loved as his own son. "Alas," he said, "I see that poor boy every night, but it softens my grief to know that he was not deprived of the last consolations of religion. God, who sees me and who knows my innocence, will enlighten the magistrates, and my honour will be vindicated." The evidence being complete, Derues was condemned by sentence of the Châtelet, pronounced April 30th and confirmed by Parliament May 5th. We give the decree as it is found in the archives. This court, having considered the trial held before the provost of Paris, or his deputy lieutenant at the Châtelet, for the satisfaction of the aforesaid deputy at the aforesaid Châtelet, at the request of the deputy of the king's attorney general at the foresaid court, summoner and plaintiff against Antoine-Francois Desrues and Marie-Louise Nicolet, his wife, defendants and accused, prisoners in the prisons of the Conciergerie of the Palace of Paris, who have appealed from the sentence given at the aforesaid trial, the 30th day of April 1777, by which the aforesaid Antoine-Francois Desrues has been declared duly attainted and convicted of attempting unlawfully to appropriate without payment the estate of Buisson-Ysseuf belonging to the Sieur and Dame de Saint-Faust de Lamotte, from whom he had bought the said estate by private contract on the 22nd day of December 1775, and also of having unworthily abused the hospitality shown by him since the 16th day of December last towards the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte, who arrived in Paris on the aforesaid day in order to conclude with him the bargain agreed on in December 1775. And who, for this purpose and at his request, lodged with her son in the house of the said Derues, who, of premeditated design, poisoned the said Dame de Lamotte, whether by a medicine composed and prepared by him on the 30th day of January last, or by the beverages and drinks administered by him after the aforesaid medicine, he having taken the precaution to send his servant into the country for 2 or 3 days, and to keep away strangers from the room where the said Dame de Lamotte was lying. From the effects of which poison the said Dame de Lamotte died on the night of the said 31st day of January last, also of having kept her demise secret, and of having himself enclosed in a chest the body of the said Dame de Lamotte, which he then caused to be secretly transported to a cellar in the Rue de la Mortellerie, hired by him for this purpose, under the assumed name of Decoudray, wherein he buried it himself or caused it to be buried. Also of having persuaded the son of the above Dame de Lamotte, who with his mother had lodged in his house from the time of their arrival in Paris until the 15th day of January last, and who had then been placed in a school that the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte was at Versailles, and desired him to join her there, and under this pretence of having conducted the said younger Sieur de Lamotte, the 12th day of February, after having given him some chocolate, to the aforesaid town of Versailles to a lodging hired at a cooper's, and of having there wilfully poisoned him, either in the chocolate taken by the said younger Sieur de Lamotte before starting, or in beverages and medicaments which the said Derues himself prepared, mixed, and administered to the aforesaid Sieur de Lamotte the Younger, during the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th days of February last, having kept him lying ill in the aforesaid hired room, and having refused to call in physicians or surgeons, notwithstanding the progress of the malady, and the representations made to him on the subject, saying that he himself was a physician and surgeon, from which poison the said Sieur de Lamotte the Younger died on the 15th day of February last, at 9 o'clock in the evening, in the arms of the aforesaid Derues, who, affecting the deepest grief and shedding tears, actually exhorted the aforesaid Sieur de Lamotte to confession, and repeated the prayers for the dying, after which he himself laid out the body for burial, saying that the deceased had begged him to do so, and telling the people of the house that he had died of venereal disease, also of having caused him to be buried the next day in the churchyard of the parish church of St. Louis at the aforesaid Versailles, and of having entered the deceased in the register of the said parish under a false birthplace, and the false name of Beaupre, which name the said Derues had himself assumed on arriving at the said lodging, and had given to the said Sieur de Lamotte the Younger, whom he declared to be his nephew. Also, to cover these atrocities, and in order to appropriate to himself the aforesaid estate of Buisson-Souef, he is convicted of having calumniated the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte, and of having used various manoeuvres and practised several deceptions, to wit: first, in signing or causing to be signed the names of the above Dame de Lamotte to a deed of private contract between the said Derues and his wife on one side, and the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte by right of a power of attorney given by her husband on the other, the which deed is dated the 12th day of February, and was therefore written after the decease of the said Dame de Lamotte, by which deed the said Dame de Lamotte appears to change the previous conventions agreed on in the first deed of the 22nd of December in the year 1775, and acknowledges receipt from the said Derues of a sum of 100,000 livres as being the price of the estate of Buisson. Secondly, in signing before a notary the 9th day of February last, a feigned acknowledgment for a third part of 100,000 livres in order to give credence to the pretended payment made by him. Thirdly, in announcing and publishing and attesting even by oath at the time of an examination before the Commission Mutel that he had really paid in cash to the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte the aforesaid 100,000 livres, and that she, being provided with this money, had fled with her son and a certain person unknown. Fourthly, in depositing with a notary the deed of private contract bearing the pretended receipt for the above sum of 100,000 livres, and pursuing at law the execution of this deed and of his claim to the possession of the said estate. Fifthly, in signing or causing to be signed by another person before the notaries of the town of Lyons, whither he had gone for this purpose, a deed dated the 12th of March, by which the supposed Dame de Lamotte appeared to accept the payment of the 100,000 livres, and to give authority to this Sieur de Lamotte, her husband, to receive the arrears of the remainder of the price of the said estate, the which deed he produced as a proof of the existence of the said Dame de Lamotte. Sixthly, in causing to be sent by other hands, under the name of the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte, to a lawyer on the 8th day of April 1777, at a time when he was in prison, and had been compelled to abandon the fable that he had paid the aforesaid sum of 100,000 livres in hard cash, and had substituted a pretended payment made in notes, the notes pretended to have been given by him in payment to the said Dame de Lamotte. Seventh, and finally, in maintaining constantly until the discovery of the body of the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte that the said dame was still alive, and that he had seen her at the town of Lyons, as has been stated above. In atonement has been condemned, etc., etc., etc. His goods are hereby declared acquired and confiscated to the king, or to whomsoever his majesty shall appoint, first deducting the sum of 200 livres as fine for the king, in case the confiscation is not to the sole profit of his majesty, and also the sum of 600 livres for masses to be said for the repose of the souls of the aforesaid Dame de Lamotte and her son. And before being executed, the said Antoine-Francois Desrues shall suffer the question ordinary and extraordinary, in order that from his mouth may be learned the truth of these facts, and also the names of his accomplices. And the decision of the judges in the proceedings with regard to the above-mentioned Marie-Louise Nicolet, wife of Derues, is delayed until after the execution of the above sentence. It is also decreed that the mortuary act of the aforesaid de Lamotte the Younger, dated the 16th day of February last, and the register of deaths belonging to the parish church of St. Louis at Versailles be amended, and his correct names be substituted, in order that the said Sieur de Lamotte, the father, and other persons interested may produce said names before the magistrates if required. And it is also decreed that this sentence be printed and published by the deputy of the Attorney General at the Châtelet, and affixed to the walls in the usual places and crossroads of the town, provostship, and viscounty of Paris, and wherever else requisite. With regard to the petition of Père Etienne de Saint Faust de Lamotte, a royal equerry, Sieur de Grange Flandre, Buisson-Souef, Valperfond, and other places, widower and inheritor of Marie-François Perrier, his wife, according to their marriage contract signed before Baron and partner, notaries at Paris, the 5th day of September 1762, whereby he desires to intervene in the action brought against Derues and his accomplices, concerning the assassination and poisoning committed on the persons of the wife and son of the said Sieur de Saint Faust de Lamotte, on the accusation made by him to the Deputy Attorney General of the King at the Châtelet, at present pending in the court, on the report of the final judgment given in the said action the 30th of April last, and which allowed the intervention. It is decreed that there shall be levied on the goods left by the condemned before the rights of the Treasury, and separate from them, the sum of 6,000 livres, or such sum as it shall please the court to award, from which sum the said Saint Faust de Lamotte shall consent to deduct the sum of 2,748 livres, which he acknowledges has been sent or remitted to him by the said Derues and his wife at different times, which first sum of 6,000 livres, or such other, shall be employed by the said Sieur de Saint Faust de Lamotte, who is authorized to found therewith in the parish church of Saint Nicolas de Villeneuve-le-Roi, in which parish the estate of Buisson-Souef is situated, and which is mentioned in the action, an annual and perpetual service for the repose of the souls of the wife and son of the said Sieur de Saint Faust de Lamotte, of which an act shall be inserted in the decree of intervention, and a copy of this act or decree shall be inscribed upon a stone, which shall be set in the wall of the said church of Saint Nicolas de Villeneuve-le-Roi, in such place as is expedient. And the deed of contract for private sale made between the late spouse of the said Sieur de Saint Faust de Lamotte and the above named Derues and his wife is hereby declared null and void, as having had no value in absence of any payment or realization of contract before a notary, and the pretended agreement of the 12th day of February last, as also all other deeds fabricated by the said Derues or others named in the above action, as also any which may hereafter be presented, are hereby declared to be null and void. The court declares the judgment pronounced by the magistrates of the Châtelet against the above named Derues to be good and right, and his appeal against the same to be bad and ill-founded. It is decreed that the sentence shall lose its full and entire effect with regard to Marie-Louise Nicolet, who is condemned to the ordinary fine of 12 livres. The necessary relief granted on the petition of Pierre Etienne de Saint Faust de Lamotte the 2nd day of May this present month, and delay accorded until after the suspended judgment pronounced with regard to the said Marie-Louise Nicolet. Signed, de Gourges, President. Outremont, Councillor. Derues' assurance and calmness never deserted him for one moment. For 3/4 of an hour he harangued the Parliament, and his defence was remarkable both for its presence of mind and the art with which he made the most of any circumstances likely to suggest doubts to the magistrates and soften the severity of the first sentence. Found guilty on every point, he yet protested that he was innocent of poisoning. Remorse, which often merely means fear of punishment, had no place in his soul, and torture he seemed not to dread. As strong in will as he was weak in body, he desired to die like a martyr in the faith of his religion, which was hypocrisy, and the God whom he gloried on the scaffold was the God of lies. On May 6th, at 7 in the morning, the sentence of execution was read to him. He listened calmly, and when it was finished, remarked, "I had not anticipated so severe a sentence." A few hours later, the instruments of torture were got ready. He was told that his part in his punishment would be remitted if he would confess his crimes and the names of his accomplices. He replied, "I have no more to say. I know what terrible torture awaits me. I know I must die today, but I have nothing to confess." He made no resistance when his knees and legs were bound, and endured the torture courageously. Only in a moment of agony he exclaimed, "Accursed money! Hast thou reduced me to this?" Thinking that pain would overcome his resolution, the presiding magistrate bent towards him and said, "Unhappy man, confess thy crime, since death is near at hand." He recovered his firmness, and looking at the magistrate, replied, "I know it, messeigneur. I have perhaps not 3 hours to live." Thinking that his apparently feeble frame could not endure the last wedges, the executioner was ordered to stop. He was unbound and laid on a mattress, and a glass of wine was brought, of which he only drank a few drops. After this he made his confession to the priest. For dinner they brought him soup and stew, which he ate eagerly, and inquiring of the jailer if he could have something more, an entree was brought in addition. One might have thought that this final repast heralded, not death but deliverance. At length 3 o'clock struck, the hour appointed for leaving the prison. According to the report of credible persons whom we have consulted, Paris on this occasion presented a remarkable appearance, which those who saw it were never able to forget. The great anthill was troubled to its very lowest depths. Whether by accident or design, the same day had been fixed for a function which ought to have proved a considerable counter-attraction. A great festival in honour of a German prince was given on the Plain de Grenelle, at which all the court was present, and probably more than one great lady regretted missing the emotions of the Place de Grève, abandoned to the rabble and the bourgeoisie. The rest of the city was deserted, the streets silent, the houses closed. A stranger transported suddenly into such a solitude might have reasonably thought that during the night the town had been smitten by the angel of death, or that only a labyrinth of vacant buildings remained, testifying to the life and turmoil of the preceding day. A dark and dense atmosphere hung over the abandoned town. Lightning furrowed the heavy motionless clouds. In the distance the occasional rumble of thunder was heard, answered by the cannon of the royal fete. The crowd was divided between the powers of heaven and earth, the terrible majesty of the eternal on one side, on the other the frivolous pomp of royalty, eternal punishment and transient grandeur in opposition. Like the waters of a flood leaving dry the fields which they have covered, so the waves of the multitude forsook their usual course. Thousands of men and women crowded together along the route which the death cart would take. An ocean of heads undulated like the ears in a wheat field. The old houses, hired at high rates, quivered under the weight of eager spectators, and the window sashes had been removed to afford a better view. Attired in the shirt worn by condemned criminals, and bearing a placard both in front and behind with the words "Wilful Poisoner," Derues descended the great staircase of the Châtelet with a firm step. It was at this moment, on seeing the crucifix, that he exclaimed, "O Christ, I shall suffer like thee!" He mounted the tumbril, looking right and left amongst the crowd. During the progress he recognized and bowed to several of his old associates, and bade adieu in a clear voice to the former mistress of his apprentice days, who has recorded that she never saw him look so pleasant. Arrived at the door of Notre Dame, where the clerk was awaiting him, he descended from the tumbril without assistance, took a lighted wax taper weighing 2 pounds in his hand, and did penance, kneeling, bareheaded and barefooted, a rope round his neck, repeating the words of the death warrant. He then reascended the cart in the midst of the cries and execrations of the populace, to which he appeared quite insensible. One voice only, endeavouring to dominate the tumult, caused him to turn his head. It was that of the hawker, who was crying his sentence, and who broke off now and then to say, "Well, my poor gossip Derues, how do you like that fine carriage you're in? Oh, yes, mutter your prayers and look up to heaven as much as you like. You won't take us in now. Ah, thief, who said I stole from you? Wasn't I right when I said I should be selling your sentence some day?" Then, adding her own wrongs to the list of crimes, she declared that the Parliament had condemned him as much for having falsely accused her of theft as for having poisoned Madame de Lamotte and her son. When arrived at the scaffold, he gazed around him, and a sort of shiver of impatience ran through the crowd. He smiled, as if anxious to trick mankind for the last time, asked to be taken to the Hotel de Ville, which was granted, in the hope that he would at last make some confession, but he only persisted in saying that he was guiltless of poisoning. He had an interview with his wife, who nearly fainted on seeing him, and remained for more than a quarter of an hour unable to say a word. He lavished tender names upon her, and professed much affliction at seeing her in so miserable a condition. When she was taken away, he asked permission to embrace her, and took a most touching farewell. His last words have been preserved. "My dear wife," he said, "I recommend our beloved children to your care. Bring them up in the fear of God. You must go to Chartres. You will there see the bishop on whom I had the honour of waiting when I was there last, and who has always been kind to me. I believe he has thought well of me, and that I may hope he will take pity on you and on our children." It was now 7 in the evening, and the crowd began to murmur at the long delay. At length the criminal reappeared, an onlooker who saw him go to the Hotel de Ville, and who was carried by the movement of the crowd to the foot of the scaffold, says that when handed over to the executioner he took off his clothes himself. He kissed the instrument of punishment with devotion, then extended himself on the St. Andrew's cross, asking with a resigned smile that they would make his sufferings as short as possible. As soon as his head was covered, the executioner gave the signal. One would have thought a very few blows would have finished so frail a being. But he seemed as hard to kill as the venomous reptiles which must be crushed and cut to pieces before life is extinct, and the coup de grace was found necessary. The executioner uncovered his head, and showed the confessor that the eyes were closed and that the heart had ceased to beat. The body was then removed from the cross, the hands and feet fastened together, and it was thrown on the funeral pile. While the execution was proceeding, the people applauded. On the morrow they brought up the fragments of bone, and hastened to buy lottery tickets, in the firm conviction that these precious relics would bring luck to the fortunate possessors. In 1777, Madame Derues was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, and confined at the Salpêtrière. She was one of the first victims who perished in the prison massacres. End of Section 7. End of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 5, Part 1, Derues, by Alexandre Dumas, translated by George Burnham Ives. Recording by jvanstan, Savannah, Georgia.